Have you ever stopped to consider how well you truly know your neighbors? What secrets might be hidden behind their friendly smiles and casual greetings? While there are no foolproof methods to identify potentially dangerous individuals among those around us, psychologists and investigators agree that people with psychopathic tendencies are more likely to commit violent crimes. If someone's behavior raises alarm bells, it's wise to maintain your distance. This chilling case revolves around Brian and Beverly Mark, a couple whose life seemed like a storybook romance. Deeply in love, financially stable, and always eager to explore the world together, their happiness was evident to all who knew them. However, their idyllic life took a tragic turn after they moved into a new neighborhood. Shortly after settling in, both were found dead in their home. Blood evidence at the scene pointed investigators to a nearby house, and the motive behind the crime left even veteran detectives stunned. Brian and Beverly first met in the spring of 2001 at a party hosted by mutual friends. Both were college students at the time, and from the moment they saw each other, it was clear they had found something extraordinary. What began as mutual admiration quickly blossomed into a deep connection, and the two became inseparable. That summer, they took turns visiting each other's families, introducing their partners to their parents, and expressing their serious intentions. Both families wholeheartedly approved of the relationship, marveling at how well they complemented each other. From an early age, Brian and Beverly had been full of life and adventure. Beverly, a gifted athlete, excelled in baseball and track, played the guitar effortlessly, and had a knack for learning new languages. Her warm smile and vibrant personality made her beloved among friends and peers. Brian, on the other hand, was drawn to thrilling and unconventional pursuits. Rock climbing, surfing, and diving were his passions, and he embraced risk as a challenge rather than a danger. A true adventurer, he made it a point to visit a new destination and master a new skill each year. When Brian and Beverly met and struck up a conversation, they instantly realized they shared the same adventurous spirit. This connection became the foundation for their passionate and fulfilling relationship. Together, they scaled mountains, skied and snowboarded, dove into the ocean depths, and tackled every wave and peak that came their way. Despite their whirlwind romance and seemingly perfect bond, the couple wasn't in a hurry to tie the knot. They wanted to complete their education first. After graduation, they shifted their focus to saving for a home. Brian began a promising career at an industrial company, while Beverly excelled as a hotel administrator, where her multilingual talents were a tremendous asset. Their future seemed bright, filled with love, adventure, and shared dreams, until their story took a devastating turn. On May 15, 2006, Brian and Beverly officially became husband and wife, celebrating their union with an intimate ceremony by the ocean. Surrounded by close family and friends, they exchanged vows in a picturesque setting. After the wedding, they embarked on an extended honeymoon, exploring several countries together. Upon their return, the couple purchased a spacious home in Graham, a quiet town in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. Nestled near a forest and a river, the scenic, sparsely populated area seemed ideal for starting a family and enjoying a tranquil life. Brian worked as an engineer for a major industrial company, while Beverly focused on her translation work and decided to pursue a second degree. The couple quickly became acquainted with their neighbors and formed new friendships in their community. However, their joyful, carefree life was tragically short-lived. On the morning of Saturday, November 17, 2007, Brian's friend Stephen arrived at their house around 8 a.m. The two had planned to go fishing, but when Stephen knocked on the door, there was no response. Assuming Brian had overslept, Stephen knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. Thinking his friend might have forgotten their plans, Stephen waited in his car for 30 minutes, repeatedly trying to call Brian, but his calls went unanswered. Frustrated and slightly annoyed, Stephen decided to head out on his own, since he had all his fishing gear with him. As the day wore on, and he still hadn't heard from Brian or Beverly, Stephen grew increasingly uneasy. That afternoon, he returned to their house to check in again. Once more, there was no answer at the door. Feeling concerned, Stephen decided to walk around the property and peer through the windows. Brian wasn't the type to vanish without letting anyone know, and Stephen's growing unease pushed him to investigate further. When he reached the garage, Stephen peered through a small window and saw the couple's car parked inside, which only heightened his anxiety. Moving to the living room window, he tried to see inside, but it was already getting dark, and with no lights on in the house, it was difficult to make out anything clearly. What little he could see, however, made his heart race. The TV was lying face down on the floor, and beyond it, something large and still appeared to be on the ground. Stephen rushed to his car, retrieved his fishing flashlight, and directed its beam into the living room. The sight froze him in terror. On the floor lay two bodies, partially covered by a blood-soaked blanket. A bare foot protruded from one side, and a hand was visible on the other. Horrified, Stephen immediately called emergency services and stayed outside the house, waiting anxiously for law enforcement to arrive. When officers reached the scene, Stephen was the first to be questioned. He recounted the events of the day and expressed deep regret for not investigating further during his earlier visit. As police examined the crime scene, they noted that the front door wasn't locked and showed no signs of forced entry, raising immediate suspicions. Inside the living room, they found the lifeless bodies of Brian and Beverly. Initial observations suggested the couple had been dead for at least 12 hours. The cause of death was confirmed as gunshot wounds inflicted by a high-caliber weapon. Each victim had been shot 3 times with precision, leaving no chance of survival. The calculated nature of the attack suggested that the assailant acted with determination and deliberation. Yet, the motive remained unclear. There were no signs of theft. Personal belongings, including cell phones and cash, were untouched, ruling out robbery. Furthermore, there was no evidence of a struggle or other injuries on the bodies beyond the gunshot wounds. Investigators were left to consider whether this was a planned execution or a deeply personal act of vengeance. Witnesses reported that the couple had no known enemies or ongoing conflicts. However, evidence at the scene indicated the bodies had been moved after the killings. Drag marks streaked with blood led investigators to conclude that the assailant had clumsily attempted to clean up the crime scene. Blood smears and splatters on walls and furniture highlighted the victims' locations during the attack. 6 spent shell casings were found on site, and surprisingly, the perpetrator hadn't bothered to collect them. Forensic analysis later confirmed the weapon used was a .22 caliber revolver. Investigators deduced that both victims had been shot with the same weapon, likely wielded by a single attacker. The undisturbed front door lock suggested that the couple had willingly let the perpetrator inside. Detectives theorized that Brian may have answered a knock at the door, recognized the visitor, and allowed them in. Perhaps he turned toward the living room after inviting the individual inside, only to be shot at close range in the back. One of the bullets exited his body and struck the television, causing it to crash onto the floor. The commotion likely drew Beverly out of the bedroom. Upon seeing her husband lying in a pool of blood and the armed assailant, she tried to escape. Tragically, she was shot 3 times in the back, collapsing in the hallway. Her body was later dragged into the living room and placed beside Brian's. Both victims were still in their pajamas, indicating the crime likely occurred early in the morning while they were still asleep. The reason for covering the bodies with a blanket remained unclear. The attempted cleanup was incomplete and disorganized, leaving behind more evidence than it erased. Drag marks were smeared, as though someone had tried to wipe them away, but only worsened the mess. A large blood stain near the bodies showed signs of disturbance, as if someone had attempted to clean it. Behind the couch, investigators found a plastic broom with dried blood clinging to its bristles. Although the broom's handle had been meticulously wiped clean of fingerprints, it was left behind. It became evident why the tool had been used. The assailant had tried to erase bloody shoe prints from the floor, scrubbing with painstaking effort. Similarly, smudged fingerprints and palm prints were found on walls, furniture, and door handles, making identification challenging. Despite the perpetrator's attempts to obscure their tracks, seasoned forensic experts knew that the longer a criminal lingered at a crime scene, the more evidence they inadvertently left behind. The longer a criminal stays at a crime scene, the greater the chance of leaving behind incriminating evidence. This proved to be the case when investigators discovered a crucial clue on the blanket covering the victims' bodies, a partial boot print. At first, the print wasn't obvious because it wasn't stained with blood. Instead, it was imprinted in an area where the floor had only a thin layer of blood, and the tread pattern was visible on the fabric beneath. The blanket was sent to a forensic lab, where specialists identified the tread as belonging to a rare brand of heavy-duty work boots with a unique sole pattern. Further investigation revealed that a construction company in Clearfield County had recently purchased several pairs of this exact boot. With this lead, investigators began questioning employees of the company. In addition to the shoe print, detectives found a palm print on one of the house's surfaces. This seemed like a breakthrough, and there was hope the case would be solved quickly. However, when the palm print was run through law enforcement databases, no matches were found. This suggested that the perpetrator had no prior criminal record and had never been fingerprinted before. The first suspect was naturally Stephen, the friend who had discovered the bodies and reported the crime. He had visited the house twice that day, which raised suspicion. Stephen explained that he initially thought Brian and Beverly were just sleeping, which was why he hadn't called the police until later. When he learned he was being considered a suspect, he was shocked and outraged, insisting that he had spent nearly the entire day fishing alone by the river, a location where no one could verify his presence, leaving him without an alibi. Despite his claims, investigators checked traffic camera footage to confirm his whereabouts. The recordings corroborated Stephen's story, showing that he had indeed spent the day traveling to and from the fishing site. Further analysis of fingerprints cleared him, as his prints didn't match any found at the scene. Tests for gunshot residue on his skin and clothes came back negative. Additionally, Stephen had no connection to the construction company that had bought the boots, and the size of the boot prints did not match his shoe size. With no evidence linking him to the crime, all suspicions against Stephen were dismissed. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed neighbors in search of new leads. When they knocked on the door of Daniel and Jennifer, who lived across the street from the Marks, they received a promising lead. Daniel answered and explained that his wife Jennifer was at work, but that he was willing to answer their questions. He disclosed that around 5:30 a.m., on the day of the crime, he heard unusual noises coming from the Mock's house, loud sounds that he later realized were likely gunshots. Feeling both curious and cautious, Daniel peeked out of his window and saw a white pickup truck parked near the Mock residence. He was sure the vehicle didn't belong to the couple. Minutes after the noises were heard, two men exited the house. Although Daniel couldn't get a clear view of them, due to the dim light just before dawn, he provided a detailed description of the truck's driver. According to Daniel, the driver was a white man, about 40 years old, with a solid build, long dark hair tied back in a ponytail, and a mustache. He also noticed a tattoo on the man's left hand, though he couldn't make out the design. While this information seemed promising, no other neighbors reported anything similar. Friends, family, and co-workers of Brian and Beverly couldn't identify anyone in their circle who matched the description or drove such a truck. Additionally, no nearby traffic cameras captured the vehicle, leading investigators to suspect the perpetrators might have used a back road through the woods to avoid detection. The truck was flagged in a county-wide alert, but no leads came in. A new suspect emerged during a conversation with detectives. Beverly's mother recalled that her daughter had mentioned a neighbor, Jeremy Flint, a few months before the crime. Jeremy, a 22-year-old, had been under law enforcement's radar for dealing illegal substances. His house was known for frequent visits by suspicious individuals, and other neighbors had spoken negatively about him. This prompted investigators to consider Jeremy as a possible suspect in the double murder. When officers visited Jeremy's home, he wasn't there. Initially, they thought he might have fled after committing the crime. Further questioning of neighbors revealed that shortly before the tragedy, Brian and Beverly had hosted a small party. Jeremy, uninvited and under the influence of drugs, had shown up unexpectedly. Witnesses described his behavior as aggressive. He harassed some of the women, insulted guests, and caused conflicts. Eventually, he was forced to leave, but not before vowing that the couple would regret it. The next day, Brian and Beverly discovered several items missing from their home, including a cell phone and a gun with ammunition that had been stored in a pantry drawer. Suspecting Jeremy was responsible, the couple decided to confront him. They went to Jeremy's house and calmly but firmly demanded their belongings back, warning him they would contact the police if the items were not returned. This impulsive threat, made to someone with ties to criminal activity, could have been a risky move. Jeremy denied taking anything and refused to return the items. However, the next day, the missing belongings were mysteriously found in the couple's backyard. Brian and Beverly were certain that Jeremy had placed them there overnight. While the incident seemed resolved, Beverly remained uneasy. She grew fearful of being alone at home and began urging her husband to consider moving to a different neighborhood. When Jeremy finally returned to town, law enforcement detained him for questioning. It soon became clear that he had been out of town for nearly a week, returning the day after the crime. He had traveled to another state to visit his parents and stayed with them for 6 days. His alibi was corroborated by several witnesses, and surveillance footage from a bar showed he had been drinking with friends on the night of the crime. Additionally, forensic analysis confirmed that Jeremy's fingerprints and palm prints did not match those found at the scene. With no evidence connecting him to the crime, Jeremy was ruled out as a suspect. When investigators exhausted all other leads, they decided to revisit Daniel, the only witness, hoping he might recall new details. During this follow-up visit, Daniel's account began to change. He suddenly remembered more about the perpetrators, including what they were wearing. He even described one of the men exiting the house and noted a scar on his cheek. This was a surprising shift, as Daniel had previously stated that the men's faces were obscured by hoodies. A detective asked Daniel to point out the window he had been looking through during the incident. Upon examining the view, the detective realized that while it was daytime, it would still have been hard to see clear details of someone across the street, especially considering the crime occurred at dawn. This discrepancy suggested Daniel might not have been truthful. But why would he lie? Could he have been involved in the crime? When investigators asked to see Daniel's shoes, he presented several pairs of sneakers, boots, and dress shoes, but none matched the footprint found at the scene. Despite this, his changing story and suspicious behavior led detectives to take a closer look at him. Daniel's background was deeply troubling. Born in 1966, as the youngest child in a military family, his life took a dark turn early on when his parents divorced when he was just 4 years old. He and his 3 older sisters were left in their mother's care, while his father remarried and showed little interest in them. By 9th grade, Daniel had dropped out of school, began running away from home, and got involved in stealing and drugs. At 18, he was arrested for robbery for the first time, but his estranged father intervened, helping him avoid prison in favor of probation, likely out of guilt. Despite this, Daniel continued to have frequent legal issues, with minimal sentences for his crimes. In the late 1980s, Daniel moved to Florida to live with his father, who tried to help him by paying for an expensive rehab program and assisting him in finding steady work. However, within 6 months, Daniel was caught stealing and dealing substances again. His father gave up and sent him back to live with his mother. By then, Daniel's mental health had deteriorated due to his addictions. Within a year, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed medication, but he rarely took it as directed. Instead, he often mixed the medication with alcohol, leading to violent and aggressive outbursts. In July 1991, during a heated argument with his mother, Daniel suddenly grabbed a knife and attacked her, inflicting nearly 30 stab wounds. She died at the scene. During his trial, Daniel claimed that he had acted under the influence of voices in his head, which he said had commanded him to kill her. However, court-appointed psychiatrists determined that Daniel was fully aware of his actions and was therefore legally responsible for the murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite this sentence, Daniel was released on parole in 2006 after serving less than the full term. While incarcerated, Daniel began corresponding with Jennifer, and the two developed a romantic relationship. She waited for his release, and when he was paroled, they married. Daniel then moved into her home in the small town of Graham, around the same time as the Mock couple. By relocating to a different state, Daniel violated his parole. He should have been arrested immediately, but a combination of police negligence and a technical error allowed him to evade detection. Somehow, Daniel's fingerprints were accidentally removed from the criminal database, which allowed him to remain undetected even after a bloody handprint was discovered at the Mock's crime scene. It seemed as though every factor was working in his favor. Further investigation revealed that Daniel had briefly worked at a construction company that had purchased the rare work boots linked to the crime. However, without concrete evidence, detectives needed to proceed carefully to avoid alerting Daniel or his potential accomplice, Jennifer. On November 24, 2007, Daniel was invited to the police station under the pretense of assisting in the creation of composite sketches of potential suspects. He eagerly agreed and spent about an hour describing and helping draw portraits of fabricated individuals. While he was occupied, another officer entered the room and casually mentioned that they needed to collect Daniel's fingerprints to rule him out as a suspect. Daniel hesitated, but ultimately agreed, confident that no traces of his presence remained at the crime scene. After the fingerprinting, the officer casually mentioned that investigators had found an unknown bloody handprint at the Marks' house. Daniel visibly tensed and began explaining that he had been friendly with the Marks and often visited their home, where his prints could have been left. The officer reassured him, noting that the handprint was clearly from the perpetrator. Another detective then shifted the conversation to Daniel's past and brought up the crime he had committed, prompting Daniel to admit that he had killed his mother. He began recounting the details of that crime with unsettling enthusiasm, smiling as he described it, showing signs of psychopathy. Meanwhile, forensic specialists were comparing Daniel's prints to those found at the crime scene, and the results came back as a perfect match. Detectives confronted Daniel with the evidence, and his smug demeanor quickly turned to rage. Before he could react, officers handcuffed him and placed him under arrest. Facing the overwhelming evidence against him, Daniel had no choice but to confess. He explained that on the night before the crime, he had spent several hours at a bar, drinking and using drugs. When he ran out of money to pay his tab, the bar staff threw him out, threatening to call the police. In a fit of rage, Daniel remembered that he had given his neighbor, Brian Moe, a tattoo the previous month as a friendly gesture. However, Daniel decided that he was owed payment for the work and arbitrarily demanded $50. Armed with his revolver, he went to the Moe's house at 5 a.m. while the couple was still asleep. Brian, annoyed by the early visit, opened the door and was immediately confronted by Daniel's demand for money. Confused and frustrated, Brian refused, telling Daniel to come back after he had sobered up. But Daniel was insistent. To defuse the situation, Brian decided to pay and went to retrieve the money from another room. As Daniel walked away, he made a comment that Brian found offensive, igniting Daniel's fury. In a split-second decision, he pulled out his gun and shot Brian 3 times in the back. The gunfire woke Beverly, who came out to investigate. She saw her husband lying in a pool of blood, with Daniel standing over him, gun in hand. Realizing the danger, she tried to flee to the bedroom, but Daniel shot her 3 times in the back before she could escape. Realizing the enormity of what he had just done, Daniel returned home and enlisted his wife, Jennifer, to help clean up the scene. Disturbingly, Jennifer appeared unfazed by his actions. Together, they moved Beverly's body into the living room, placing it next to Brian's, and covered both with a blanket. It was Jennifer who suggested using a broom to erase the bloody footprints. She also wiped down surfaces to remove fingerprints, though she missed one crucial handprint. Once the cleaning was completed, Daniel disposed of the murder weapon by throwing it into a nearby river. Despite extensive efforts by investigators, the revolver was never recovered. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife, Jennifer, expressed deep remorse, claiming that she had helped him out of fear for her safety. She was sentenced to 1 year in prison for tampering with evidence. In 2015, while renovating the property where Daniel had lived with his mother, new homeowners made a chilling discovery. During excavation of the backyard, they unearthed human remains. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to a young neighbor who had gone missing in 1990. Investigators determined that Daniel had been romantically interested in the woman, But after she rejected his advances, he responded with lethal violence. He buried her body in his mother's backyard, where it had remained hidden for decades. This crime led to Daniel receiving a second life sentence.